I want to welcome everybody to the Breakthrough Institute's webinar on Beyond Carbon Farming, an innovation agenda for climate-smart agriculture. My name is Thea Bonadias. I am the Director of Events for the Breakthrough Institute, and I am going to be turning it over to Jenny Splitter, our moderator from here on out. Take it away, Jenny.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for saying the title, so now I don't have to. Welcome. I am going to be joined today by the authors of a new paper. Dan Blaustein-Rejto is the Director of Food and Agriculture for the Breakthrough Institute, and Uris Baldos is a research assistant professor from the Department of Agricultural Economics at Purdue University. And now I'm done. I just had to remember those two lines. And we're going to get started, but I want to let everyone know that if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, but we'll try to keep an eye on the chat and the Q&A, and we'll try to get to all your questions. So first I'm going to hand it over. Oh, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Jenny Splitter. I'm an independent journalist, and so now I'm going to turn that over to Dan, and he is going to kick us off.
Thanks, Jenny, and thanks, everyone. About 2 weeks ago, researchers at the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization and the Joint Research Center released a new study estimating that the food system from farm to fork to disposal accounts for about 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions and about 1/4 of emissions in the US. Now, this large amount of emissions is expected to continue rising with population growth, income growth, shifting diets, perhaps as much as 60% or so by 2050. Well, we all know that in order to halt global warming, we need to bring emissions down to net zero. Now, a big portion of this rise is set to come from land use change. Perhaps as much as an area the size of as much as 2 times the size of India is expected to be put under the plow, while at the same time there are going to be great increases in the amount of fertilizer, fuel, methane emissions from cattle, and much else. Now, the scale of this impact from agriculture is what motivates much of our work at the Food and Agriculture program at Breakthrough. And this is really what motivated me and Uris to work together to investigate creative policy options for how to basically grow more food per acre with less fertilizer, fuel, and other inputs. And one of the things that we find, and that's really well borne out in the academic literature, is that perhaps the greatest policy lever for doing this, for increasing yields and input efficiency in agriculture, is government research and development funding. Advances in crop breeding, farm equipment, and much else has enabled farmers in the US to increase crop yields 4, 5 times even for corn over the 21st century, while reducing the amount of cropland and even reducing greenhouse gas emissions per pound or per bushel, per unit of food, basically, in the US over the past couple decades. Now, given the historic relationships between research and development, R&D, and productivity and land use, greenhouse gas emissions, Uris and I use a model that he's been developing for the past couple of years to estimate the impact of doubling agricultural R&D funding that comes from the government. And we estimate that doubling it just over the next 10 years or so would enable farmers to globally to use a lot less land than they otherwise would, an area of land about the size of Iowa, and will also reduce emissions about 100 million metric tons more than would otherwise happen. Now, to put that into perspective, that's about 1/3 or so of current cropland emissions in the US, and 100 million tons is also the amount of climate mitigation you might get from scaling up common solutions that we hear a lot about in the news, like cover crops. It's substantially more than you might get from increasing use of like seaweed to feed cattle and no-till farming and some other solutions like that. However, the trends of R&D are really going in the wrong direction right now. For a long time, funding has been stagnating, if not declining. That's caused some economists to raise concern that crop yields might be plateauing, productivity might be slowing. Now, to reverse this trend, we really need to double down on R&D. I think that means doubling funding for existing R&D programs. We have some really excellent research facilities and programs that have been developed for years in this country. AFRI is one. It's the chief grant-making program to universities and other researchers, as well as the government's in-house research service, the Agricultural Research Service. I think that funding research alone is actually not sufficient, although we don't get into this in our analysis. For scientists to do their best work, they also need adequate research facilities, greenhouses, laboratories, and more. And yet in the US, we have a multi-billion-dollar backlog when it comes to maintenance and facility construction. So we really need to kind of walk and chew gum at the same time and tackle both of these problems. And then one last thing I think that's really interesting that comes out of our analysis is, and Uris might get to this more, is the importance of ensuring that other countries are able to benefit as much as possible from US innovation. We find that when other countries are able to take productivity enhancing research innovations and adapt them to their local context and otherwise increase productivity in other countries, that the environmental benefits from R&D here are doubled. It's a really enormous impact. And I think the environmental benefits of this type of tech transfer and R&D in general are widely overlooked and have been long neglected. And I personally hope that with rising support for climate action and this new work that Uris and I have done, which is really some of the first to quantify the environmental benefits of R&D in the US, that this will no longer be the case, and R&D will find its place among other climate policies.
Great, thank you, Dan. And now Uris, for your perspective.
Yeah, so I think Dan has touched the general idea in terms of how R&D could be a way for us in order to boost productivity and at the same time ensure environmental security. Because as we know, if we're more productive, we're going to use less inputs. That means less fertilizer, less land, and so on. One thing that I would like to add is that there's this temporal component in terms of what we're spending today and how it will affect in the future. So we've calculated in our past work that it takes around 10 to 15 years from investments now to actually have an impact in productivity in the future. So, and this is the thing that is important when considering about investing in agriculture, because, typically, especially if investments are motivated by political means, the gains from your investments now would not be realized by like 4 or 8 years, for example. So we really need to think in terms of long term when we're doing these R&D spending. And then another thing is that what we're doing is we're looking only at like R&D sector. R&D is like the whole sector. So we're think about capacity. We didn't do in the paper specific technologies that we need to invest. So right now, what we've only covered is that we need to think about investments in R&D as in terms of investing in capacity. So ensuring that there's a funnel of graduate students becoming professors and becoming researchers in institutes, and these people who are funded by these grants are going to make these technologies and make them more available to the future. So yeah, and then finally, I think one thing that I would like to extend on is this capacity of knowledge transfer. So historically, the technologies developed in the US are typically adapted by countries which share the same types of crops and also the same types of weather conditions that are applicable here in the US. So for example, think about soybeans and wheat, that those technologies would be adopted by European regions, Russia, for example. More recently, some technologies in soybeans are adapted in Brazil. But not all countries could benefit directly because they're planting different types of crops. So for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, they don't really plant a lot of wheat. They plant like roots and tubers and other grains. So for those cases, not all of the technologies developed here in the US could be adopted in those parts of the world. And this would mean that they either invest in their own R&D or we help them by training their students here or for funding their local plant breeding programs.
Great, thank you so much. That really helped give me some context for the papers. And now I'm gonna kick it off with some questions, but I want to encourage folks to bring your questions to the Q&A and we will try to answer them. Just to start, I guess, and you guys kind of touched on this, but can you maybe just go over sort of how we know that kind of increasing funding in the US will eventually have this impact globally? What's kind of the evidence for that so that we can sort of, know that's actually going to happen?
So I could quickly answer that. So the way we try to estimate these impacts is typically we use statistics. We track how productivity trends are in other regions and how productivity trends are here in the US. And we then try to link those observed productivity data using the time series in terms of R&D spending. So essentially we're thinking about like correlation. So we're estimating those correlation wherein what would happen if we increase US R&D, there's going to be some correlation coefficient that translates those increases in R&D to increases in productivity elsewhere. Of course, if you dig deeper to the actual programs that they're doing, you could maybe identify some specific agricultural technologies that's being developed here in the US that's being adopted in other regions. But yeah, in our paper, we didn't really dig deeper to those particular details. We just use statistics.
And then Dan, can you maybe tease out a little more about this sort of local context concept, which I guess is related to my last question a little bit, but I know sort of, how we improve productivity in other regions has to be kind of the way we sort of share those technologies has to be locally appropriate. Is there anyone, can you say, I guess, a little bit more about sort of the practicalities of how we do that? Is there anyone working on that who's doing a good job? Do we have examples of where that's worked or not worked?
Sure, and Uris, feel free to jump in. So there are a couple of, I think, mechanisms through which that happens. Primarily, I'd say that there's some indirect effects where research that's happening in the US, for instance, on hybrid corn, which happened in like the 1930s and 40s, slowly is adopted by farmers here, researchers here, and eventually by researchers elsewhere who, as Uris said, perhaps partner with breeders, as well as through, I guess, more direct investments. So again, with hybrid corn, there have been direct international research efforts, sometimes funded by donors in the US, as well as oftentimes by national governments in other countries to really take some of these innovations and breed various traits into local crop varieties, as well as to work with farmers directly to better understand their limitations and needs, whether when it comes to nutrient availability, whether the crops need to will be irrigated or rain fed, what the pest conditions are, whether they'll be stressed by new pests that perhaps the crops need to be made more kind of resilient to.
Just to add one anecdotal story here at Purdue. In our department, we have professors and researchers who have worked in Niger and in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, wherein they develop these, essentially think about big Ziploc bags that allows them to avoid post-harvest losses. So when they harvest, let's say, sorghum, typically they just put it in like weaved baskets, and those typically are like attacked by pests and so on, so they can't use it. So I think this work is partly funded by the US aid, and also by private company like Belinda and Gates Foundation. So in that particular instance, we see that the simple technologies that here in the US could actually have a much large effect in terms of avoiding post-harvest losses for some parts of the world.
Okay, great. That's really interesting. Oh,
I wanted
sorry,
to
go ahead.
jump off of something that Uris said earlier also about timing. I think it's a really fascinating and important point, which is that, as you said, Uris, investments now in R&D don't pay dividends for many years, for 10, 15 years on average. Every different research project has a different payoff, really, and some of them never pay off, right? But
that's good.
I think this is really important to understand because many people push back against proposals, I think, to invest money in R&D because that money could be invested elsewhere too, right? It could be given to farmers right now for them to, adopt cover crops or to change their practices. But I think it's really key to, to really seize the, I think, political opportunity of the moment. This interest in, climate mitigation, in just kind of climate-focused innovation broadly in agriculture, energy, and elsewhere, to boost funding now while there is political support, so that we can get the dividends necessary in the future.
Okay, great. And then I guess I see a bunch of questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to get to them, but I want to just ask one more of mine, which is, how do we know so this paper focused mostly on sort of increasing productivity. And I've written a lot about, or talked to a lot of people about sustainable intensification and what really is that. And so I'm wondering about this like sustainable side of intensification. And, we could get into the regenerative, or we could not right now just yet, but basically, there's a lot of political pressure and a lot of enthusiasm for different kinds of practices. So I guess, like how do we know kind of what are the best kind of areas to invest in? And I guess also, is it just about, is the argument that we should just sort of get as much as we can out of the piece of land so that we can save other parts of land, other, wild land, and sort of preserve that? Or is there, where is sort of the sustainable part of sustainable intensification come in?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And in part it gets at whether we should keep doing, I guess, R&D the same way we have been historically. Should there be really this, as strong a focus on increasing crop yields, on this kind of intensification component, or on reducing input use, like growing crops with less fertilizer, or I guess really, third option is really to put those aside and grow food in ways that just have smaller environmental impacts, finding ways to sequester carbon better, or just cut methane emissions from cattle. And honestly, I can't help but answer that we really need all three. I think that we definitely can't sacrifice the focus on yields. That is, incredibly important, especially at a global level, continuing to increase crop production and animal production as food demand rises, and without expanding kind of cropland into new areas. So that is absolutely key, but I would never argue that we can only focus on that, because it's increasingly clear that we need to find ways to produce that food, in particular with a lot less fertilizer, a lot less impacts from fertilizer. It's a particularly large and growing problem, and the same is true for methane from cattle. And I think there are some exciting innovations on that front, but probably the biggest opportunities both to reduce nitrogen losses and methane losses are to globally share some of the innovations and best practices that have already been developed in many countries more globally.
Yeah, so I think right now, at least for the US, the focus more is on trying to reduce input use. So we've seen in the past couple of years this rise of digital agriculture. We here at Purdue, we have like drones flying all over the field and taking snapshots so that they could pinpoint what particular nutrient need a certain plant is. Does that plant need, is it being infected by pests, or does it need water, and so on. So I think that more, that this rise of digital ag, wherein you don't just spray fertilizer, you just pinpoint part of the field that really needs it. I think that's much more being adopted here in the US and also elsewhere. And then another thing is we also, since we're generating all of these informations, there are these decision tools and artificial intelligence that I would give farmers good guidance in terms of what they need to do based on what the drones have gotten, and so on. So I think that focus of collecting information and using less inputs compared to what we've traditionally used here in the US is the way forward, at least in terms of improving efficiency in US farming.
I want to touch on the food security aspect of this for a second too. I think it's tempting to think that we can just kind of focus on maybe carbon sequestration and either innovations or practices that let's just grow the same amount of food as we currently do, but sequester more carbon, reduce emissions. And certainly those things are really important. But if we do those without increasing yields, without increasing crop production, just as food demand grows, then food prices grow as well, and food becomes less affordable, less accessible, raising serious food security issues and risks. One of the really interesting findings, I think, from our analysis is just that increasing R&D funding here, just in the US, has a pretty significant impact on future food prices. That's not something that you would expect to see from increased adoption of kind of cover crops or just increased carbon sequestration alone, or something that was just focused on climate.
I guess, if we're talking about sort of the dietary part of, what we eat in the future, it seems like in the US, what we need to do is eat less beef. And so, and I know you guys have another paper on this, on investing in all proteins, so I guess I'm sort of like spoiler, but yeah, sort of like, how do you balance, since the need in the US, I think is so much for us to really do some of these dietary switches. How do we balance kind of this drive to invest in ag with sort of investing in all proteins and research there?
I have lots of thoughts on that, but I'm curious, Uris, do you want to jump in with anything?
Well, I think for the synthetic lab-grown meat, I think there's a strong private interest on that one. We see a lot of companies who are investing in these labs. So I think they see it as an option to profit. And I don't know whether there's a scope for public R&D to be invested on that front, because it might be, but that it's already being funded a lot by private entities. But yeah, those are my current thoughts on that front. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I see it a little differently. Yeah, I think first, Jenny, that alternative proteins definitely have a large potential environmental kind of benefits. And I think Uris and I certainly would agree on that. I imagine that even the current set of alternative proteins, mostly plant-based meat, like Impossible Foods, their carbon footprint is something like 90% smaller than that of beef, and they use less land, less water than these products. They're a little bit more expensive right now, which is, I think, really interesting from, I guess, a kind of economics perspective. In the sense they're producing meats with, I guess, more inputs. Otherwise it wouldn't be as costly as it is. But I do expect those prices to go down over time with kind of as these companies improve, as there's more demand, as they scale up, and as there's more research. But there are some important R&D priorities, I think, for the field that are pretty long-term, which companies are having difficulty investing in right now. In particular, a lot of the meat that Americans consume is not ground beef or ground meat or kind of processed meat. A lot of it is steaks, chicken breasts, chicken thighs, things of that nature. And there's really no good alternatives to those right now. And I don't think there will be for a while. I'd love to see them. But I think that type of R&D right now is considered, quite risky. It's not sure if there's going to be a payoff. It's not sure. No one's really sure if it's even, I think, possible to create a high quality synthetic steak. I'm certainly skeptical, and if I was an investor, I don't think I'd put my money in that right now. But that's a place where I think the government, in collaboration with companies and investors and other sources of capital, could kind of de-risk those fields.
Yeah, I've only tasted the nuggets, so I don't know, but I agree. Like, if we're talking about swaps, we kind of need to be moving beyond the fried nuggets and the ground. Okay, so I'm going to get to some of these questions, and actually the first one's kind of gets to this, okay, how are we implementing this? Are there any legislative vehicles for an increase in ag R&D right now? Seems like the Growing Climate Solutions Act might pass in some form. Is there R&D funding in that?
No, there's not R&D funding in that. There are some old bills which were introduced. I don't remember the names off the top of my head, but there was a bill, I think 2 years ago, introduced that would have pegged the rate of growth for R&D funding at 5% per year. It was like the Sustainable Research Act or something along those lines, which seems like a very kind of pragmatic and practical approach that would be a bit robust to changes in political whims. Even if the current administration or Congress raises R&D funding by 20%, maybe in 2 years, different party will be in power and they'll stop raising it that much. So I think that type of kind of commitment, an act that would commit funding, would be a pretty promising way to go.
I know we talked about this during the call, but I feel like, it seems like there's just so much chatter about regenerative ag that it makes me, I don't know if, that's if the right philosophy is to, invest in research, because otherwise because we're going to do it anyway, we may as well have the research. But that is sort of where my mind goes. Like, if there's so much momentum to have this carbon farming, then I would at least rather have there be some solid research behind it. And I'll be running for president next. I don't know. That's just my idea, but I don't know, how to sort that out.
Yeah, that's a good question. And actually, to the earlier question too, there are a few other bills which were proposed, which I had forgotten about. I think one, they're all pretty climate focused. So I think Shelley Pingree introduced the Agricultural Resilience Act, which had a number of different sections and proposals, including increased R&D funding. And then likewise, Cory Booker's climate plan, which was introduced during his presidential campaign, also called for, actually, I think several candidates called for doubling or tripling agricultural R&D. So I think there is growing kind of democratic support, and it's long been a bipartisan issue. So hopefully that will pan out. On the regenerative agriculture carbon farming front, I absolutely agree that there are a couple different research areas which need to be invested in there. The NRCS, which is a part of the Department of Agriculture, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, has some like soil survey programs, which I think could really be leveraged to collect more data on soil carbon and help researchers and farmers better understand what might be the impact of adopting no-till farming in North Dakota in one county versus in a different county in Illinois, for instance. So there's definitely a huge need and gap when it comes to data in that field, which various types of existing R&D and conservation programs could help fill. Do you have any thoughts on that, Uris?
Yeah, I mean, so I think there are some like practices between the regenerative and carbon farming that are the same, like, you know, carbon tilling. So I think,
Right.
so the way I see it, it's more of there may be some synergies that we could pursue, and maybe better to pursue those synergies rather than, you know, compete in terms of, you know, think about these as competing practices. Maybe we could just identify the set of current farming practices that could address both goals that we want to achieve through the carbon farming and also through the regenerative farming.
Yeah, like have some teeth behind it would be, because I don't know, that's also my concern, is it feels like a lot of people are sort of like, well, I do no-till, sign me up, you know, without there necessarily being some kind of pressure to sort of make sure we're really making improvements. I think this is, could you quantify the private side of investment? Like the numbers, and I think that's what this question is. If I'm wrong, right back.
Yeah. So the problem with private R&D is, especially when we're thinking of these long-term relationships, is it's only just recent, maybe past 2 decades that we've collecting these data. So we don't have enough time series data to track these correlation between observed productivity and past R&D spending. What we've done so far is used like public R&D data stretching back to 1965. So that has a longer time series. So we could be more confident that, yeah, there's this kind of relations. But for public R&D, for private R&D, we don't have enough data to have these statistical relationships. But I'm sure through time, when we collect more and more data as we progress, maybe in 2040, we could do some sort of analysis with private R&D too.
And private R&D also, and correct me if I'm wrong, Uris, currently I think there's more funding in the private sector for agricultural R&D than in the public sector, but it typically goes to different areas. Private sector R&D, there's a large portion that goes, I think, to food manufacturing. There is quite a bit that goes into crop breeding and crop development, but there's actually quite little that goes into livestock and animals, according to like the last analyses I've seen. And there's actually more money going towards that type of livestock health and productivity research from the public sector. And besides focusing on different things, the timescales often differ. That private sector companies, investors kind of demand a certain rate of return, over pretty short periods of time. They can't take the same types of long-term, 10, 20-year risks that researchers at universities and other government-funded places can.
Okay, so this question is, if we increase R&D funding, do we see similar emissions reductions in crops as in livestock? Or are the I guess like what is the relationship between that?
Yeah, so right now, what we've looked into is only for productivity in crops and how that translates to, essentially GHG emissions within the crop sector. We haven't really dealt with livestock as a separate sector yet. I think that's going to be something that we want to take a look into later on. But yeah, I mean, a lot of the, especially like the methane emissions, which are like really high GHG emissions, it's important to also to do this type of analysis looking into the livestock sector.
Yeah, and I'm really excited to look into that too. At least I'm optimistic about that analysis. I think that over recent decades, at least, the carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions per unit of beef, milk, chicken they've all fallen over time as really animal yields have increased, the amount of meat and milk produced per animal. And given that the private sector, well, I guess given that the public sector really has played such a large role in R&D in livestock, it's possible that we'll see pretty substantial, I think, improvements from increased R&D in that sector. So the opposite is also potentially true. There might be diminishing returns over time. However, I think that there's substantial, climate potential when it comes to livestock R&D.
So an anonymous attendee asks, why do we need to improve yields? Why do we need more corn? Which kind of reminds me of, I don't think I posed this question yet, but like, the US ag system is known for being super efficient. So it's like, even if I take a different view of that question and say, okay, we know like being super efficient is great for climate, but is there a point at which, okay, you've topped out on that efficiency, so investing anymore really isn't the way to go? So that's a slightly different question, that like, why do we need more corn, but related maybe.
So yeah, when I think about increasing yields, I think about like not just increasing output, but more like reducing input use. So reducing the environmental footprint. And this is where the digital ag thing that I was talking about earlier, I think that comes into play, because you're going to have the same, essentially producing the same amount of outputs, but you're going to use the same less of inputs. So in that particular sense, I think there's still a lot of scope to improve yields, like by reducing input use. But yeah, I agree. There are physical limits in terms of what the plant can grow, in terms of the biomass and so on. So yeah, and we need to be aware of those particular limits.
Go ahead, Dan. Sorry.
I was just going to say, when it comes to corn, it obviously comprises an enormous portion of the U.S. farm system, and it's a really interesting example to kind of zoom in on, because there are many different ways that it's supposed to use that corn production system more efficiently, in addition to increasing yields or just producing the same amount with less fertilizer. There's lots of scope for that, as Uris said. We could also use less of it for biofuel, which is a very contentious topic, but certainly using less of it for biofuel would enable more of it to be diverted to animal feed or to exports. There's some places where corn is consumed as food. Not that type of corn isn't consumed as food in the US, but it definitely has major food security impacts globally. And then certainly there's a huge number of other crops that I think have been neglected when it comes to yield improvement. Wheat, actually, despite how much we grow of it, its yields have grown far more slowly than those of corn. And new research that was actually funded by I think USDA or maybe the National Science Foundation helped map the genome of wheat. And now a number of companies are really building off of that government research to pretty much develop hybrid wheat. It's kind of how we have hybrid corn, which is just basically more productive wheat, which might be coming out in the next couple of years, which will modestly but significantly still increase wheat yields.
Yeah, sorry, I was like in between, like ask another question, go to the next one. I guess it's just in my mind, I'm thinking like I was just trying to tease this out for a story, but like there's this relationship between sort of the dietary part and the changing the dietary guidelines and basically making sure that farmers are growing enough of these other crops so that people eat those things. So it's sort of this double-edged sword of like, farmers right now are yes, growing a lot of corn and all this stuff. And so we want to kind of increase those yields and there are these benefits there, but we also need to be mindful of that dietary impact of like making sure if we want to, encourage dietary shifts, that there's something for people to eat, that there's enough legumes there. So if everybody goes crazy on lentils, which I keep pushing for. I don't know if that was a question or just a total rant.
No, I mean, I have thoughts on that. In energy, at least, people talk a lot about like push-pull policy, kind of how you need both these demand side incentives for companies, governments, utilities, customers to buy more clean energy, but you also need, of course, policies that will help the construction of those clean energy facilities and develop new energy technologies to make it all cheaper. And I think that you can apply a similar paradigm or framework in agriculture, that there are demand and production side policies, and there are, I guess, there's more cultural and political, I think, resistance to demand sides, definitely to anything that requires, any entities, whether it's governments or schools, to purchase certain foods. But there are some voluntary policies that cities and companies are adopting, mostly when it comes to meat, but not only. There's some companies and universities that have signed something called the Cool Food Pledge, where they pledge to reduce just the greenhouse gas emissions from their food by a certain percentage. And so that creates this demand signal to companies, farmers, and others to try and bring their emissions down. So I think we need that, as well as R&D and production side policy changes.
What role do you see for aquaculture in fighting climate change? I want to take that. Simple question.
Yeah, I don't know if there are, I mean, a lot of like the GHG emission studies are focused on livestock. I'm sure aquaculture, it has a low GHG footprint. Maybe there's some water footprint there, but I think if people shift to more eating, away from beef and eating more fish, I think that would have an impact in terms of, reducing methane emissions because you're eating less cow and so on. So yeah, I think it has a crucial role too.
Yeah, I think that honestly, fish demand globally is rising pretty dramatically. It's not something we think a whole lot about, I think, here, because just kind of seafood and fish consumption in the US is probably like way below average globally. Yeah. But it is certainly important, and wild fish stocks can't meet that demand. I think already something like 50% of fish comes from aquaculture. Some of it's not, the most environmentally friendly by any means. So I think there do need to be not just technological advances, but just regulatory improvements in many places. And part of that probably, as part of that, I think we should think about the future of aquaculture in the US as well. Right now, there's not much. It's mostly prohibited in many places by federal law. And we may have the kind of technological and regulatory wherewithal to actually practice aquaculture quite well, quite efficiently, with quite minimal environmental impact. So I expect to see definitely more aquaculture in the future, and hopefully more in the US.
We kind of already touched on this, but maybe I think we hinted at it without getting into it. So maybe what were the main findings about the opportunities for alternative protein R&D? Could you just sum it up in one tweet?
Oh, basically, there's a strong government case, I think, for investments in alternative protein research and development, given both the kind of the social and environmental benefits, the lack of incentive for private companies to work on some long-term projects and priorities, and also the benefits of basically publicly available research. A lot of the research basically all of the research that happens in private companies is kind of held safe within the company, walls through intellectual property rights, and that just hinders the growth of startups and other companies. So that's one more reason that the public sector can play an important role.
Shoot, where did that go? Oh, this is a really good question. There was a couple questions on regenerative ag, but this one, the big question is how to scale regenerative ag practices. What is your opinion on the role of big tech, Microsoft, IBM, in scaling these practices? Microsoft and USDA have a partnership from 2019, and it appears that digital integration is critical to connect soil data to monetizable markets. It's quite a sentence.
Well, this is very much a different topic, which I think we can and should have a whole different webinar around.
But we did put carbon farming in the title, so I feel like we should get into it.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's not to avoid the question. I think that any program in which companies are able to offset greenhouse gas emissions through soil carbon, which can be released from the soil over short periods of time, isn't kind of as permanent as something like carbon storage and kind of geological rocks, is a risky strategy for climate mitigation. That includes kind of Microsoft's efforts. They have bought carbon credits as part of their initiative to kind of offset their historical emissions. They bought some carbon credits from different farming projects. Most of those projects have very little transparency as to how they, what the practices were, how long they'll be implemented for, whether there are safeguards for that land to be farmed with those practices for 10 years or 50 years or in perpetuity. And there's also very little transparency as to whether these projects are, how they're affecting crop yields. If they're reducing crop yields 5–10%, that might induce other farmers elsewhere in the world to increase production a little bit. And that, I think, needs to be taken into account. But again, there's pretty much like zero accountability, it seems like, in this space of soil carbon markets right now. I think that's a really urgent priority for the sector and for policy.
Yeah, be skeptical when you read stories, not written by me, but have cite numbers of I shouldn't say magical, but cite numbers of carbon sequestered when I don't think we actually know for sure that that's happening. I think the numbers themselves, might not be accurate, yet somehow people are making lots of claims.
Yeah, Carbon Plan, the organization Carbon Plan put out an excellent report yesterday about Microsoft's initiatives, which I recommend anyone interested to check out.
So we are going to answer the rest of your questions on the Twitterverse or by email. But we have to wrap up now. I mean, I have nowhere to go, but everyone else does. But this has been really great. I wish we could talk more. We'll have another. Maybe I can con you guys into letting me host one on just the carbon farming debate, because I think that one is a pretty good one that I'm into. I don't want to be arguing, but I'll be happy to moderate and eat popcorn. It's a great topic. Thank you all for coming, and thanks Uris and Dan, and thank you Breakthrough for inviting me. I almost forgot to thank you guys. Hopefully we can meet again in person soon.
Well, thanks, Jenny, and thanks everyone else. Thanks, Uris.
Thanks.
Uris is not on Twitter, so if you have questions for him, either let me know. I'm at Dan-Rejto, and you can also email us. I think you can find our emails online pretty easily.
I'm at Jenny Splitter, and I live on Twitter, so I'm always there. Yay. Bye.